So think of the pineal gland as a radio receiver. The pineal gland is a tiny gland that sits between the back of your throat and the back of your head. And the pineal gland's primary function in normal three-dimensional reality is it manufactures two neurotransmitters called serotonin and melatonin. I mean, it has some other functions, but let's talk about that.
So the majority of people's thoughts are connected to certain feelings that influence very specific hormonal centers in the body. For example, if you think an angry thought, you are going to release certain chemicals that activate your adrenal system. You're going to begin to activate survival systems. If you feel suffering, or if you feel pain, or you feel guilty, you produce a different biochemical reaction, produces different hormonal centers to be activated. So most people's thoughts and feelings are taking most of the energy of those thoughts and storing them in the first three energy centers of the body. People call them chakras, but the first three centers are centers of survival. And the procreation, consumption, and fight or flight is how most people have survived the majority of their lives. In other words, in survival, it's not a good time to open your heart. So very little people actually make the effort to open their heart. And most of their thoughts and feelings are activating these lower centers. So the majority of the body's energy is stored in these first three centers. So then 95% of that energy stored in the body has to be liberated and driven back to the brain. So we do this breath as a way to pull the mind out of the body or send the energy. And yogis would probably love this breath because they have a lot of conscious control over the intrinsic muscles of their body. So the breath is about contracting those intrinsic muscles, the muscles of the perineum, the front and back muscles we use for elimination, the muscles of our lower abdomen or upper abdomen. When we inhale through our nose and we squeeze these muscles, what we're doing is we're pulling that energy from those lower centers up into the brain.
Now, the moment you wake up in the morning and your eyes open up and the wavelength of visible light is perceived in your eye, that wavelength of light hits the optic nerve, and the optic nerve sends a signal to a nucleus, which then sends a signal to another part of the brain, and then all of a sudden, the pineal gland gets the signal to make a chemical called serotonin. Mm-hmm. Serotonin is the daytime neurotransmitter. Right. Our brain go into what's called beta brainwave patterns, and now we're alert, we're aware, we are aware that we have a body, we're aware that there's an environment, and we're very aware of time. Now, the inhibition of light or the loss of light, when it gets dark, all of a sudden there's no more wavelength of light, the pineal gland switches off, and it takes serotonin and it begins to make another chemical called melatonin. Melatonin is the nighttime neurotransmitter, and melatonin then begins to change our brain waves into alpha, theta, and ultimately delta, and the body now can go into restorative sleep. So serotonin gets us up, melatonin puts us to sleep, and it's a function of what's called the circadian rhythm. Mm-hmm. How the sun rises and sets, people get used to that rhythm, right?
Yes.
So, however, there's latent systems in the brain when the pineal gland becomes activated. It has tiny little crystals in it that are calcite crystals, calcium carbonate crystals, and they're kind of rhombohedrons. So when the pineal gland becomes activated, those tiny little crystals begin to shimmer, and they begin to become electrically activated. And once they become electrically activated, they become sensitive to frequencies, mm-hmm. not frequencies of light. Light has to go through the eyes, through the senses. Once it's activated, it begins to pick up frequencies that are not perceived by the senses, and it transduces that frequency, because that frequency is carrying information, into very profound imagery. And now the person is having an inner vision. That's why it's called the third eye. Mm. And that inner vision is way more real than anything you've ever experienced in your three-dimensional reality. This is a very, very low frequency, but this is a very fast frequency. And all of a sudden, the pineal gland begins to make metabolites. Now, melatonin is already an antioxidant. Mm-hmm. But now, the derivatives of melatonin, when this gland is activated, produces very powerful antioxidants that heal. anti-cancer, anti-aging, anti-heart disease, anti-stroke, anti-neurodegenerative, anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial. You take the molecule, you tweak it again, you have a benzodiazepine. What is that? That's Valium. It's your body, melatonin already relaxes you, but now, hang on, you are going to really chill out. You're going to be, survival centers in your body are going to be shut off, because that's what benzodiazepines do. They shut off your survival centers. So now you feel relaxed. It produces a chemical that puts the body into stasis. The first three centers, you lose sex drive, you lose appetite, you lose the preoccupation with your environment. The body is no longer, the mind, it's no longer driving us. Now you can dream without being interfered with your body.
Now, when you inhale, normally when we're just hanging out and breathing, when you inhale, the sutures of your skull slightly open up, and your bone, the base of your spine, called your sacrum, that upside down triangle, actually flexes back. So when you inhale and those sutures open up and your sacrum flexes back, the spinal fluid drains. When you exhale, the sacrum flexes forward and those sutures close and it pushes the fluid up. And so inhaling and exhaling begins to propagate a wave. Now, cerebrospinal fluid is made of proteins and salts in solution. And proteins and salts in solution have a charge. When you drop them in solution, they have a negative or positive charge. So now when you begin to inhale and you begin to pull that cerebrospinal fluid up towards your brain and you accelerate those charged molecules, according to physics, when you accelerate a charged molecule, you create a invisible field called an inductance field. So now there's information going from your brain to your body and from your body to the brain all the time. But when you do this breath and you start accelerating those charged molecules, you create this inductance field moving in a certain direction, and all of a sudden, all that energy from those lower centers start moving up to the brain. If you do this properly and you have a little passion and you start moving this fluid, there'll come a moment where the sympathetic nervous system will switch on and merge with the parasympathetic nervous system. And when that happens, all of a sudden, all the energy you use to make a baby, all the energy you use to digest a meal, all the energy you use in a stress response, instead of it being released out chemically, it's being drawn up to the brain. All that energy goes right up into the limbic brain, and it hits a gland called the pineal gland.
It produces a chemical that's the same chemical found in electric eels. Now, the nervous system becomes amplified. Now it's electric. Your brain is going to switch on and you're going to have a lot of energy in there. And it produces that same chemical called dimethyltryptamine, which is a very powerful hallucinogenic. And now your brain is going to literally perceive another world, and it's going to be more real than this world. And we activate that system because I want people to realize that they're not a linear being living a linear life. That we are dimensional beings living a dimensional life. And you only need one of those experiences, Tobias, and you can't go back to being the same person again, because you realize this probably is the illusion and more real. So there's a principle in biology, and it's an important principle. It's called endowment. And endowment means nature never wastes anything. Mm-hmm. So the principle in nature is if you don't use it, you lose it. Just get rid of it, right? So why do we have 98.5% of our DNA unused and it hasn't gone away? Why do we have this gland that hasn't been used by its full capacity? How come it's still there? We have all this. How come we have these big brains and we're not capitalizing off of that? Because those systems are waiting to be activated. It's our divine aspect of ourselves. So yes, it takes a great effort. Yes, it takes a great will. But just like anything else, once that system begins to switch on, everybody says the same thing. That was so worth the effort. When you start pumping that cerebrospinal fluid, there's little cilia on the end of the pineal gland, little hairs. When the fluid starts moving through the brain, through those caverns, it tickles the hairs. Mm-hmm. When we have people inhale and they hold their breath and they pump that fluid, they're pushing that fluid up against those crystals. Mm-hmm. And the crystals, this is research now, have a piezoelectric property. What does that mean? When you compress those crystals, the compression of those crystals mechanical stress turns into an electrical charge. Now, once they're electrically activated, they start to shimmer. Once they start to shimmer, they're now going to receive information, and now it's a radio dial. It's going to pick up information, and the brain's going to transduce it into imagery. And now that latent system switched on, and hang on, because people say, I want the unknown, but whoa, when it comes, it's big. Look, I mean, do you believe that everything that we're learning about the Egyptians is everything? No. Our research shows that when that system switches on in the brain, the entire limbic system of the brain, the limbic brain, in our research is on fire. It is highly activated. What is the limbic system? It's the pineal, it's the pituitary, it's the thalamus, it's the hypothalamus, it's the corpus callosum. It's just little package right underneath there, the hippocampus, the amygdala, this whole kind of network. That eye of Horus is a side section of that part of the brain. So our research shows that that limbic brain switches on. The Egyptians knew the thinking brain was the architect, the designer, and that this system was the creator. So design it with your thinking brain, but then surrender it and get out of the way and allow this system to hook up to energy and begin to turn it into to an experience. So I think the Egyptians, there's a lot of secrets in that culture that we haven't been told. Certainly the gods were real. Certainly the pharaohs had a connection to the gods, and certainly there were initiations that were about activating another world.